Okay guys, so here we go. Let's get started with the entry level. First up, we have ceiling flowers. It seems a little, I don't know how to explain it. Almost too simple, like there's no thought into it. I do like that none of the subjects are cropped off essentially, but it just seems like more like a snapshot than a compositionally thought out shot. So I don't know if this would be something that could actually be photographed in a unique way. It seems like it's hard to tell. It seems like they are hanging from a ceiling and the image has been kind of flipped upside down, or they're maybe hanging off a sidewall here. But yeah, I think it's just kind of a lack of subject here. You know, your eye doesn't really know where to look. It doesn't really do much rule of thirds for me, breaking or applying. So for this image here, I'm going to award a score of 8. Next up, we have blooming at spring. Once again, subjects in the center here, so breaking the rule of thirds. Nice sharpness, nice focus on the center of the flower. As far as negatives go, it's a little busy in the background. So top left corner, you have another flower, and then kind of right center of the frame, you have some green parts of other flowers or other stems sticking there. So you know, a clean background goes a long way. So for the photographer, if you reshoot this shot, try to shoot it to where you see the flower and there's nothing else behind it. No distracting objects there. So for this image here, I'm going to go with a score of 9. Next up, we have got new landmark of New York, Hudson Yard V. I like the symmetry going on in it and kind of the grid look here, and it does break the rule of thirds by just putting it right in the center here. But there are two things that kind of negatively impact the image, and that is the left-hand side. The top left-hand side, you have all that black from the wall. That's essentially negative space, which is kind of pulling my eye there. That's pretty much what I see first off. And then the Neiman Marcus sign is cropped off at the top there, so that's a little bit distracting here. To be honest, I think this shot would be really nice if the photographer had kind of squared up to the window and shot a bit tighter to where all you see is part of the landmark out there amongst the gridded windows. And that would eliminate all the negative space on the left and right hand side and the sign as well. So it would have been kind of more of like a telephoto abstract shot. So for this image, I'm going to award a score of 9. Next up is Water Lily, and for this image here, really nice shot. It's centered up again, and it just looks a little soft though, looks a little bit out of focus and oversaturated as well. So for this image here, maybe try to tone it down a bit and you know, get the focus a little bit better here. Also, just the bottom left and bottom center parts of the flower are really close to the edge of the frame there, so maybe give a little bit more space there to balance things out. So for this image, I'm going to award a score of 10. Next up, we've got the image called Intrigue. Alright, for this image here, it's a nice little moment. It doesn't, once again, really break the rule of thirds. I mean, it is centered up, but it doesn't scream, you know, rebel in my mind. The shot's great, the moment's great, but it also is out of focus. And for the crop, the fact that the last little talon is kind of cropped off at the bottom there really gets me here. Once again, if you're going to break the rule of thirds, I would love to have seen maybe a really, you know, kind of wider shot and just put the bird in the bottom right corner and that's it, and just had it all isolated by itself. You know, rule of thirds, breaking it is not just putting it dead center. You could put it in one of the lower quadrants or upper quadrants all by itself, and that would be a good way to break the rule of thirds. So for this image, I'm going to give a score of 10. Next up, we've got Blue Truck Plano Auto Show. And on this image, it's great contrast. I mean, a beautiful subject, just right in your face there. It's almost cropped a little too tight, and this doesn't really, for me, break the rule of thirds. I feel like the curves of the truck from the bottom left to the top right kind of flow you through the image here. And also, there's definitely an artificial depth of field added in, and that's pretty obvious with the masking around the vehicle. So not a big fan of that. So that's actually quite distracting. I love the subject and the overall scene. Maybe would have liked to see this shot more square on with that girl centered up in the frame and kind of going more for a symmetrical look amongst the truck. I feel like that would have broken the rule of thirds a little bit more here. So for this image, I'm going to award a score of 10. Okay, next up, we have got Lime Splash. I love that it's once again right in the center. You have great contrast with the lime splashing in there and a little bit of action too. The biggest thing that kind of affects me negatively on this image is that whatever light source, I guess your key light, it hits the upper part of the glass, but not the bottom part. There's a few little highlights down there at the base of the glass, but it almost looks like it blends in a little too much with the black background. So it kind of gets lost. It almost looks like it's floating a bit. But yeah, I love the fact that it's put right in the middle here. It draws your eye in nicely. The contrast is great. So for this, I'm going to give it a score of 10. Next up is Morning Dew. And this is a really nice kind of macro style shot here. Love the color contrast and the detail. Really like the fact that you kind of got like the dying center of the flower, and then you've got the really beautiful petals on it that are still all intact, which whenever I've tried to photograph flowers, I can never find a flower that seems like it's actually perfectly intact like this. So good job there. It definitely breaks the rule of thirds, throwing it right in the middle there. Good framing. You're not cropping off any of the petals there. So for this, I'm going to give a score of 11. Next up, we've got Great Gray Owl, Tetons National Park. Love the shot. It's a absolutely beautiful owl. I love the moment looking right at you. The contrast is great. The white balance seems to be just a little bit off, as the owl seems to have kind of a greenish hue as well to it. Once again, breaking the rule of thirds by putting it center, but not really being too creative with breaking the rule of thirds. I would love to see this shot where maybe the owl's eyes are just hovering over the bottom center of the frame, and you just see from essentially its beak up, and the rest of the frame is negative space. But yeah, I'd like to see this maybe cropped, or not cropped, but like shot differently to where just the eyes are peeking over the bottom part of the frame, and then everything else is negative space. Also, whatever it's got in its feathers there is just quite distracting. So if it was shot differently where it was just from the beak up, you wouldn't even see that there. So for this image, I'm going to award a score of 11. Okay, next up, we've got Looking Up the Chicago Bean. And really dig this shot here. I've seen many images of the Chicago Bean, and usually it's kind of from out further or people taking their own reflection. So this is kind of a unique perspective. Yeah, breaking the rule of thirds, putting the center right in there. And I think it works for this image here because that way you kind of get a mirrored reflection and symmetry. If you were putting it over one side or the other, it would just, I don't know, it seemed kind of wonky. It'd break the rule of thirds for sure, but I don't think overall compositionally it would work. So yeah, good job here. Definitely a unique perspective. And I'm going to give a score of 11. Next up is titled Navajo Waters. Let's talk about the pros first. I love the fact that you have the beautiful leading line right through the center of the frame. It's got really nice contrast, kind of warm and cool tones. The image, it's a little bit flat. It needs to have a little bit more depth to it. You can tell that it looks like this might be two scenes masked together. And so the mountains off in the distance, they just look a little bit flat. Plus also when you're shooting mountains, the left and right side of your frames, you always want those mountains to kind of lead you down. You want the mountains to not lead you up and out. So yeah, there's a little bit of chromatic aberration and haloing as well, maybe a little bit of over sharpening on the edges. And some of the sky seems like it has some highlights that are blown out. But overall, as far as rule of thirds go, I love having the leading line right through the middle there. The horizon, if you're going to break the rule of thirds, needs to be a little bit lower. So, I mean, compositionally, it's great. But for breaking the rule of thirds, I'd like to see the rules be broken a little bit more. I'm going to award it a score of 12. Next up, Clean Bud. Absolutely love the colors in it. I love the depth of field as well. Really brings your eye to the bud. The color contrast is nice, and it's nice to see that the highlights are not blown out here. Now, it's hard to tell if this was cut and pasted in. If it is, it looks really clean though. So good job there. There's no haloing. Nothing seems out of place. And I love that it is smack dab right in the middle of the frame. And it says, hey, look here. For this image, I'm going to award a score of 13. In the entry-level category, first place is Clean Bud with 13 points. Second place goes to Navajo Waters with 12 points. Third place goes to Looking Up the Chicago Bean with 11 points. And honorable mention goes to Great Gray Owl, Tetons National Park, and Morning Dew with 11 points each. Alright guys, let's move on to the intermediate category. First up is the image entitled Layers. I feel like it lacks a definitive subject. And I understand what the photographer is going for here, only because of the title Layers. If I was looking at this image without a title, I'd have honestly no idea what I'm looking at. And my eye would kind of go everywhere throughout the frame. So for this image, I would give it a score of 8. Next up, we've got Sonoma breaking the rule of thirds. And this image is kind of breaking the rule of thirds, but kind of not breaking the rule of thirds. So you've got balance in this image, and you've got the bell balancing out with the cross there. So it is kind of breaking the rule of thirds because it's not properly framed, but at the same time, it is also going with the rule of thirds. The image here, there's definitely some flaws in the editing, which definitely scream to me. You can look around the edges of the beam there and also the cross. There's some pretty significant chromatic aberration going on. That is something that's so very easy for you guys to clean up, especially if you're in Lightroom or Adobe Camera Raw. For this image here, though, I would award it a score of 9. Next up, we have texting in Manhattan, which, is definitely a trend up there. Once again, subject's right in the middle here, but the image, if you're going for street photography, you're going for kind of storytelling, and this image is just a guy on his phone, and I'd like to see more of the environment around him to see what is going on, what's he missing, what's he ignoring. But yeah, just right now, it's just a picture of a guy on a phone, and I'd like to see more to this, more thought into composition, and that may help this image out a bit. I'm going to award it a score of 9. Next up, we've got Mighty Oak in Fall. And this image here, in all honesty, and I'm always going to give you guys my honest feedback, it just kind of lacks any thought as far as composition goes. Right now I see just a picture of a tree. I would like to see, maybe the leading lines worked into this frame here, or more of a detailed shot zoomed in on the leaves of the tree. So for this image here, I'm going to give it a score of 9. Next up, we have Game Day, and a nice image here. Some really great symmetry going on in the frame here. It just seems a little bit overexposed. The fountains are blown out. The sky on the left-hand side is blown out. Also, I have a really kind of big issue with images that aren't level. And this image is not level. And that's kind of one of the things that you could very easily fix in post, or just take the time to do when you're out there in the field. So yeah, to change this up, I would love to see this image shot at a much slower shutter speed, to where you're blurring not only the fountains, but you're blurring the motion and the people. Right now, it's shot at such a fast shutter speed that my eye is really distracted by the people. And try to use maybe like a neutral density filter to slow your shutter down to like maybe a second or 2 seconds. And the motion in the water and the motion of the people, that's gonna make this image so much more interesting. I'm going to give it a score of 10. Next up, we have the image titled Ella Ann with Attitude, and she definitely does have some attitude. As far as rule of thirds, once again, smack dab in the middle, but it looks like it may have been cropped to kind of break the rule of thirds. The portrait, I'd like to see just a little bit more with the portrait, something different. Like I said, it's lit well, but it lacks interest. So for this image here, I would give it a score of 10. Next up, we have the image entitled Crystal Falls Mill. And really nice shot here. Been here as well. Lovely place in Marble, Colorado. The subject is smack dab in the middle here. But I would have liked to seen this image shot just a little bit different time of day. I can tell that this image was shot right in the kind of smack dab middle of the day, or maybe a little bit later in the day. But it lacks some substance in the sky as well. That blue automatically draws my eye right to the sky, that negative space up there. So clouds and landscape photography make all the difference. So just a different time of day or different day entirely for this shot right here would have worked out nicely. Plus, it looks like it was cropped to kind of fit the theme of rule of thirds. So I'd like to see how the image was shot in its entirety. But for this image here, I'm going to give it a score of 10. Next up, we have Tower Bridge. It's a nice moment. The bridge is lit up, not necessarily overexposed. You got a couple on the right side, which you can tell they've been together for a while, and a couple on the left side, they may just be kind of on their first date. Once again, rule of thirds wise, it's smack dab in the middle, but it's also cropped that way. So I'd like to see the original 2x3 image here to see how the image was shot. It's a nice moment, like I said. The color's great. Took advantage of blue hour really well here. Overall, just not really knowing where to look in this image. I'm going to give it a score of 11. Next up, we have the image entitled Perched. I don't know why I laughed at this one, but I like the shot. Seagulls always make me laugh. Definitely goes against rule of thirds with the subject being smack dab right in the middle there. The image technically though looks like the white balance is off a little bit here. Looks a little bit warm or orangey, and would like to see this edited a little bit better. But like I said, it goes definitely against the rule of thirds, but the processing could be improved just a bit here. So I'm going to give it a score of 11. Next up, we have Old Stove. I love detail shots. You know, this definitely shows that the photographer's thinking outside the box and not just looking at the big picture, looking at the tiny pictures as well. Love all the detail, just how the paint's kind of peeling off of the stove there, and it's a nice shot looking down. It's definitely a different look and unique, and that's what I love about photography is how people can walk up to a stove and make it look cool. The image here, once again, dead center, but it works in a way that is intriguing, and especially the negative space around the burner there. So for this image, I'm going to award it a score of 11. Next up, we have the image entitled Lighthouse Staircase. And this is the hard part of being a judge, is I love the image. It's got some beautiful flow, leading lines to it, but the competition is entitled Breaking the Rule of Thirds. So this image goes everything for the rule of thirds. You've got beautiful lines, beautiful structure through the frame, lots of flow from the corners into kind of the middle there. So it's really hard to not give this a higher score, but kind of goes against the theme of the competition here. I'm going to award it a score of 11, although it is a fantastic image. Next up, we have Ice on Black Sand. So for this image here, I'm assuming that this is from Iceland. I've been to this black sand beach many times and really like the shot. It's a great reflection. It's got the subject right in the center of the frame, which obviously goes against the rule of thirds there. And some nice symmetry. I think I might have liked to see this shot just a little bit lower angle-wise. It looks like there's some sun coming in from the backside of it, so it would have been nice to see off in the distance on the horizon what was going on there if it was a really nice sunset or sunrise. But for this image here, I'm going to give it a score of 12. Next up, we have Flying High, and we've got the Blue Angels screaming in. And I really enjoy this image here because it does break the rule of thirds The image is smack dab right in the middle, but you have kind of a leading line with the smoke of the airplanes, and they have flow from left to right throughout the frame here. So whenever you guys are photographing some sort of moving object, it's always good to make sure that that object is moving through the frame and not necessarily out of the frame. So for instance, if this image was shot with the planes all the way on the right side of the frame, they'd be kind of moving out of the frame, and it would almost just feel unnatural. But the photographer framed this up nicely, and the composition's nice, and it's nice and sharp. So for this image, I'm going to give it a score of 12. Next up, times square, or times round, pi, not thirds. And for this image here, I really love the creative use of a fisheye lens. And it is a beautiful shot of Times Square, really nicely exposed, and definitely does break the rule of thirds here. Everything's kind of pointing right towards the center, and it's negative space there. So I love the way that this is a completely different approach on Times Square. And the photographer essentially said, hey, I'm going to throw the rule thirds out the window. I'm going to have this negative space right in the middle, and I love this shot. So for this shot, I'm going to award a score of 13. Alrighty, and the awards for the intermediate category. First place goes to Times Square or Times Round, pi not thirds, with 13 points. Second place goes to Flying High with 12 points. Third place goes to Ice on Black Sand with 12 points. And the two honorable mentions go to Lighthouse, Staircase, and Old Stove, both with 11 points. Alrighty guys, let's move on to the advanced category. Next up, cloud-like volcano eruption at Mount Kaidi. Sorry if I mispronounced that there. Nice image here. The image has a lot of negative space though in it, with the top and right parts of the sky. There are clouds in the scene here, but when you're really lacking clouds like this scene does, it's always great to go in for a tighter crop, and that will help fill the frame here. I'd also really love to see this image shot at like sunset or sunrise, where those clouds may have some color to them and there might be some side lighting on the volcano. So for this image here, I'm going to award a score of 9. Next up, we've got Amarillo Storm, and any storm photo always has my heart. I think I understand what the photographer was trying to do with the container down in the bottom left of the frame there. But my eye, it immediately goes there, but I know that's not the subject, and that's apparent by the title of the image as well. It's not Amarillo Silo or Amarillo Container, it's Amarillo Storm, so the photographer wants me to look at the storm there. So that's a little bit distracting. Also, on the mid and upper left-hand side of the frame, there's some sensor spots. Those are very easy to remove in Photoshop or Lightroom using the spot healing brush. Definitely remove that. For this image here, I'm going to give a score of 9. Next up, we have Garden Gate. You've got a beautiful leading line, kind of S-shaped leading line with the pathway there. I don't necessarily know where the photographer wants my eye to go here, because it immediately goes to that bright bush, but then the leading line of the pathway kind of leads me around that bush in a way. The highlights are a little bit blown out on that bush there. I'd love to see this one's getting shot different time of day. And you guys have heard me mention that a few times. So for anything outdoors, really try to focus on, pre-sunrise or post-sunset, or just right after sunrise and right before sunset. You get some really nice soft lighting. I'm going to award a score of 10. Next up, we've got red doors and a cat. Really nice image. It does work with the rule of thirds though, so not necessarily going against it. I love the red contrast. The cat's a nice touch there. And I love that the photographer, their vertical lines are actually truly vertical, so that's nice as well. I'd love to have seen this break the rule of thirds more. For this image here though, I'm going to award it a score of 10. Next up, we've got landmarks, and that's for sure. We've got the Manhattan Bridge here with the Empire State Building framed up nicely in the middle there. It kind of breaks the rule of thirds, and I kind of keep saying that over and over because Some of these images break the rule of thirds, but not completely. Image is centered up here, but you have the buildings on the left and right hand side kind of leading into the middle there, so they're acting like leading lines, converging lines, pulling you right to the middle of the frame here. The guy on the cell phone in the middle there is a nice little touch for just a human element. But what really screams at me here is the Dumbo West Elm sign. I know the photographer wants me to look at the Manhattan Bridge here, but my eye automatically goes to that red on green sign there. So I would definitely suggest, if they had the opportunity to reshoot this, to walk past that sign and frame up this image here. And I've actually shot on this street before, and I know that you can walk past that and still get the Empire State Building framed up there in the bottom of the arch. So for this image here, we're going to go with a score of 10. Okay, next up we have St. Paul Lutheran Church, and this is a really nice image here. Really nice leading lines with the tiles, nice balance with the pews on the left and right hand side here. But once again, it kind of breaks rule of thirds, but also it works with the rule of thirds here. So for this image here, I'm going to award a score of 10. Next up, we have Anna, and the image, it's interesting, but I think the subject is more interesting, and the subject is already another piece of art. So essentially it's a photo of a piece of art. So that's what makes this image interesting here. The sense of scale with the children there definitely helps the image, but the image also appears to be maybe a little bit stretched or distorted vertically. So for this image here, I'm going to go ahead and award a score of 10. Next up, we've got the World Trade Center Oculus, and this is a very unique image here. I've seen a lot of shots from the Oculus, but nothing like this. It looks like it's actually got part of the World Trade Center reflecting or kind of peeking through the Oculus there. The lighting on it is great. It does break the rule of thirds really nicely. Everything's kind of framed up to be on the right-hand side of the frame. I'd like to see just a little bit tighter crop from the bottom there. You've got a couple highlights that pop out, and that black silhouetted building that's kind of arching there captures your eye. I'm going to go with a score of 11. Next up, we've got Wisteria. A really nice macro shot of a really beautiful flower plant here. And I love the kind of softer depth of field here, so you can definitely tell the photographer thought this through. Clean background, so your eye really goes just to the flower, nice lighting on it. There's one thing at the bottom though that really kind of distracts me a little bit, and that's how close the flower is to the bottom of the frame there. So you have kind of equal space on the left and right hand sides of the frame, and I'd like to see that applied to the bottom there. So once again, the subject's right in the middle of the frame, but just the small little details like the bottom of the flower there pretty much touching the frame, is the negative for this image. I'm going to give a score of 11. Next up is a beauty, showing off. Absolutely love all the detail, the color in this image here, and it does break the rule of thirds, but so close to really breaking it. For this image here, I'd love to have seen the photographer shoot or possibly crop essentially the bottom part of the image off. So essentially from the bottom part of the feathers, that top part of the bottom part, if that makes sense, crop right there. So you literally just have the head of the animal sticking up there, and then all the detail around it with the beautiful feathers. So for this image here, I'm going to award a score of 12. And next up, we've got the dome inside St. Stephen Basilica, Budapest. I probably messed that up. But for this image, absolutely love it. Love the exposure, all the colors. It definitely breaks the rule of thirds. Subject's right in the middle there, and then you have kind of the semicircles of different arches, I'm assuming, on the bottom and left and right side of the frame here. But there's still flow to the image. So I absolutely really like it. I'm pretty sure this is an HDR image, and it seems to be done pretty well. For this image here, I'm going to award a score of 12. Next up, we've got Hanging Around. And absolutely love this image. I love the black and white. I love the silhouette. And it is a great use of breaking the rule of thirds. You've got most of your subject, most of your content on the right side of the frame, and then the one lone bird, actually two lone birds, that are both simultaneously silhouetted and moving off from right to left, giving that flow leading from the right-hand side to the left-hand side of the frame into all that negative space. Really enjoy this image here, and even some of the small details, like in the bottom right, the bird that's just hanging out all by itself there. I'm going to give it a score of 12. In the advanced category, first place goes to Hanging Around with 12 points. Second place goes to The Dome Inside St. Stephen Basilica, Budapest, with 12 points. Third place goes to Showing Off with 12 points. And the two honorable mentions are Wisteria with 11 points and the World Trade Center Oculus with 11 points. Alright guys, last up is the Master category. And for this category, I'm going to be a little bit tougher on you guys because this is the Master category. First up is Joy, and it's a nice shot here. It looks like it's definitely been manipulated, almost kind of like a watercoloring effect to it. So not sure if this is a painting or if this is a photograph. Nice shape to the model, right smack dab in the middle, and some nice use of lighter to darker tones to kind of vignette in. For this image here, I'm going to award a score of 9. Next up, we've got End of a Perfect Day. Really nice silhouetted sunset shot here. The sun is right in the middle of the frame here, so it does break rule of thirds. Beautiful glow. The biggest thing though is this image has a lot of negative space on the top and bottom. So no clouds really in the top portion of the frame except for that small little thin layer there. And a lot of black in the bottom part. So my eye, it kind of battles between looking at the sun and also looking at the black space there. So you know, you could shoot this in a bracketed manner to where you can expose what is in front of the sun here, or you can do it where you crop it a little bit differently. I think if you, the photographer had cropped just a little bit of the silhouetted vegetation at the bottom and then gone straight up, this image would be a way more powerful example of breaking the rule of thirds, and it would have eliminated a lot of that negative space. I'm going to award a score of 9. Next up, we've got Cherry Blossoms in DC. A nice shot, a nice detailed shot here. Pretty harsh light, so some pretty gnarly shadows going on there. The image, once again, is straight up, centered in the frame here. I do like that the photographer is kind of looking up the tree here, so it's a unique perspective. But there's also some distracting factors, and that's the green on the right-hand side, those leaves, the branch that sticks up in the right-hand corner. Good use of depth of field here though to kind of really bring in the audience's eye on the flowers. Once again, just different time of day goes a long way. So for this image here, I'm going to award a score of 10. Next up, we have At the Theater, Balloon Rising from Come Fly With. Once again, we've gone centered up with our subject. A nice kind of rim light effect on the audience there. Really beautiful color contrast. It does break the rule of thirds, but I'm just never a big fan of photographs of another essentially show or art piece, because the work is really essentially done by the stage lighting and the people setting up the show. So for this image here, I'm going to award a score of 11. Next up, we have blue tiles and really unique perspective on some tiling of the wall, looks like, or a building. Love all the repeating shapes, but once again, rule of thirds. It doesn't really do too much for me here. And also, it's already a shot of something else that somebody else has created. So it's a nice shot, and I understand why the photographer shot it. But for this category or this contest, it doesn't really work for me here, so I'm going to give a score of 11. Next up, we got, I believe it's Olney's Lighthouse. Really nice lighthouse shot here, smack dab right in the middle. The pathway gives a good leading line. Nice clouds, which help fill the sky. If this was a completely bluebird day, there'd be a lot of negative space in this image. So this is a pretty good example of how clouds can definitely help an image. It looks a little bit grainy. I'm not sure if this was shot on a cell phone, or if this is just compression here. But yeah, and once again, I'd love to see different time of day, that sunrise or sunset time frame. This image is going to have a lot more feel to it. So for this image, I'm going to give a score of 11. Next up, we have nature's symmetries. This, I'm not sure where this is. I'm thinking maybe a glacier, probably off there. But really nice landscape shot. It's split 50-50 on the horizon, which is essentially the first thing rule of thirds says not to do is don't split your horizon 50-50. Good job there breaking that rule. It has a couple of issues. Looks like the image has been over sharpened a bit. There's some haloing and chromatic aberration going on around the trees and the mountains there. Also, I'd really like to see this shot at a better time of day, and also using a longer exposure, so a neutral density filter or shooting at blue hour, to where the photographer could use a 10 or 15 second long exposure to really frost over that water there. So for this image, I'm going to award a score of 11. Next up, stair steps to heaven, and I had to take a few looks at this image to really kind of figure out what in the world was going on here. Really unique perspective, nice flow and repeating patterns, which essentially are acting like leading lines throughout the frame here. It does break the rule of thirds essentially because the frame is leading you through the middle to the top here. A few things that are negatively impacting the image, and that's the bottom left right corners with the ambient light down there. And then just the one little thing, it looks like a bolt on the bright side of the middle of the frame there. But once again, it kind of goes back to photographing something else that's already art. So for this image here, I'm going to give a score of 11. Next up, we've got the image called Tulip, and really love this image. Really nice shape to the tulip, and love the thought process of the photographer here to focus inside the tulip rather than on the petals. And they use the petals to kind of frame up really nicely with the center of the tulip here. Great depth of field. It's shot so shallow that even the little bit of green in the background doesn't bother me, doesn't really grab my eye. The only thing that does bother me is that the crop. It's really close on the right hand side, but then you have all that space on the left hand side. So I like to see this image a little bit more balanced on the crop. I'm going to award a score of 12. Next up, we have battered ceiling fan. I love the thought process of the photographer. A lot of people would never think, oh, let me just point the camera up to the ceiling and take a picture of the ceiling fan that's just falling apart. But absolutely really love this shot here. I love the textures, the shapes, the color contrast, all the paint peeling off, and this is a great use of breaking the rule of thirds with just the subject right there in the middle, but a lot of different elements also working with the image here. So for this image right here, I would award a score of 12. Alrighty guys, so in the master category, for first place, we have battered ceiling fan with 12 points. In second place, we have tulip with 12 points. Third place, we have stair steps to heaven with 11 points. And the two honorable mentions are nature's symmetries and Alani's lighthouse, both with 11 points. And the Best in Show award goes to Battered Ceiling Fan. This image really grabbed my attention just because of its use of color, symmetry, repeating patterns, and just putting the subject smack dab in the middle of the frame, and that brown on those blue and pink colors really pops out. So for this image here, it was an image that really just broke the rule of thirds in my opinion, but also was technically and compositionally sound. So congrats to the photographer. Well, that's it, guys. I truly appreciate the opportunity to look over your amazing work. Keep it up. Pay attention to negative space and clouds and light. All of that will really amplify your work. So I'm looking forward to see what you guys produce in the future, and good luck.